He was just 8 years old when he walked into those woods. 3 years later, his dog came back with a bloody sock in its mouth. And what happened next would shatter everything this small town thought they knew about that summer day in 2019. If you believe that every missing child deserves to be found, if you believe that some mysteries should never be forgotten, subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us tell the stories that matter most. The forests of Pine Ridge, Montana, stretch endlessly in every direction. Dense canopies of evergreen trees create shadows so thick that even at noon, the ground below remains dim and cold. It's the kind of wilderness where a person can disappear without a trace, where search parties can walk within feet of something crucial and never see it, where time moves differently and 3 years can feel like 3 decades. This is the story of Tommy Brennan, 8 years old, bright blue eyes, a gap-toothed smile that could light up any room. And on July 15th, 2019, he vanished into these woods like he had never existed at all. His family searched, the police searched, volunteers came from 3 counties away, but Tommy Brennan was gone. Until his dog returned with that sock, and suddenly everything changed. But this isn't just about a missing boy. This is about the secrets that small towns keep, the lies that parents tell themselves, and the devastating truth that sometimes the person you're looking for has been right there all along. Chapter 2. Who was Tommy Brennan? Tommy Brennan was the kind of child who made adults remember why they wanted to have kids in the first place. At 8 years old, he possessed that rare combination of curiosity and kindness that seemed to draw people to him like a magnet. His 3rd-grade teacher, Mrs. Henderson, would later tell investigators that Tommy was the student who always helped others tie their shoes, who shared his lunch without being asked, who raised his hand not because he wanted attention, but because he genuinely wanted to understand the world around him. He lived with his mother, Sarah, in a modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, just 4 blocks from the elementary school. Sarah was a single mother, working double shifts at the local diner to make ends meet. She was 26 years old, with the same bright blue eyes as her son, and a fierce protective instinct that anyone who knew her could see from a mile away. Tommy's father had never been in the picture. It wasn't something Sarah talked about much, but neighbors knew that she'd moved to Pine Ridge when Tommy was still a baby, starting over in a town where nobody asked too many questions about the past. She and Tommy had built their own little world together, complete with Saturday morning pancakes, bedtime stories that went on too long, and a golden retriever named Buddy who followed Tommy everywhere he went. Buddy wasn't just a pet. He was Tommy's shadow, his constant companion, his best friend in the way that only a boy and his dog can be. They were inseparable. When Tommy rode his bike around the neighborhood, Buddy trotted alongside. When Tommy played in the backyard, Buddy was there. When Tommy went to bed, Buddy curled up on the floor beside him. The boy loved the outdoors with an intensity that both thrilled and terrified his mother. He could spend hours in the small patch of woods behind their house, building forts out of fallen branches, collecting interesting rocks, chasing butterflies with Buddy at his side. Sarah had taught him the basic rules of outdoor safety. Stay where you can see the house, never go past the big oak tree, and always take Buddy with you. Tommy was responsible for an 8-year-old. He followed rules. He checked in with his mother. He understood boundaries, which is why what happened on July 15th, 2019 made no sense to anyone who knew him. Chapter 3. The Disappearance. The morning of July 15th, 2019 started like any other summer day. Sarah had worked the night shift at the diner and was catching a few hours of sleep before her afternoon shift began. Tommy had eaten his cereal, brushed his teeth, and was playing quietly in his room with Buddy, just like he did every morning when his mother needed to rest. At 10:30 a.m., according to the neighbor's security camera, Tommy and Buddy were seen in the backyard. The footage shows a normal scene, a boy throwing a tennis ball, a dog chasing it, the kind of innocent summer morning that should have been just another forgotten memory. But something changed between 10:30 and 11:15 a.m., something that would haunt everyone who loved Tommy Brennan for years to come. Mrs. Rodriguez, the neighbor who lived directly behind the Brennan house, was watering her garden when she heard Buddy barking. Not his usual playful bark, but something different, something urgent. She looked up to see the dog standing at the edge of the woods, barking toward the trees, his tail rigid with alertness. Tommy was nowhere to be seen. Mrs. Rodriguez called out, assuming the boy was just deeper in the woods than usual. "Tommy, Tommy, honey, where are you?" But there was no response. Just Buddy, barking at something she couldn't see. She walked to the property line, calling Tommy's name louder now, a small knot of worry beginning to form in her stomach. The woods were dense here, the trees so close together that you could lose sight of someone just 20 feet away. But Tommy knew these woods. He'd played in them hundreds of times. He knew the boundaries. For 15 minutes, Mrs. Rodriguez stood at the edge of the trees, calling and listening. Buddy had stopped barking and was now whimpering, pacing back and forth along the tree line like he was trying to decide whether to go in or stay put. Finally, she made the decision that would change everything. She woke up Sarah. Sarah Brennan came running out of the house in her pajamas, her hair disheveled, her eyes wide with the kind of panic that only a mother can feel. She called Tommy's name with a desperation that made Mrs. Rodriguez's own heart race. She ran into the woods without hesitation, crashing through undergrowth, following paths that Tommy had taken dozens of times before. But the woods were silent, empty, as if they had swallowed her son whole. By noon, Sarah was on the phone with 911. By 12:30, the first patrol car was pulling into their driveway. By 1 p.m., the search for Tommy Brennan had officially begun. What nobody realized at the time was that Buddy never went into the woods that day. The dog, who had never left Tommy's side, who had followed him everywhere for 3 years, simply sat at the edge of the trees and refused to move. Refused to help look for the boy he loved most in the world. Later, much later, they would understand why. Chapter 4. The family's initial reaction. Sarah Brennan's world shattered in the span of 15 minutes. One moment she was sleeping peacefully in her bed, exhausted from another long shift at the diner, and the next she was standing in her backyard, screaming her son's name into a forest that seemed to swallow the sound without offering anything back. The first officers on the scene were Deputies Martinez and Johnson from the Pine Ridge County Sheriff's Department. They found Sarah at the tree line, still in her pajamas, still calling Tommy's name, even though her voice was already growing hoarse. Her hands were scratched from pushing through branches, her feet bare and bleeding from running across rough ground. "Ma'am, we need you to step back and let us handle this," Deputy Martinez said gently, but Sarah couldn't hear him, couldn't process anything except the fact that her son was gone. It took 3 neighbors and both deputies to convince Sarah to come inside and answer questions. She sat at her kitchen table, shaking uncontrollably, trying to remember every detail of the morning. What time had Tommy gotten up? What had he eaten? Had he mentioned wanting to go anywhere? Had there been any strangers in the neighborhood? The questions felt surreal. This was supposed to be a normal Tuesday. Tommy was supposed to be playing in the backyard. She was supposed to wake up at 2 p.m., make him lunch, and get ready for her afternoon shift. This wasn't supposed to be happening. Mrs. Rodriguez sat beside her, holding her hand, trying to offer comfort that felt impossible to give. "He's smart, Sarah. He knows those woods. He's probably just got turned around. Kids do that sometimes." But Sarah knew better. Tommy didn't get turned around. Tommy followed rules. Tommy always came when she called. By 2 p.m., word had spread through Pine Ridge like wildfire. In a town of fewer than 3,000 people, everyone knew everyone, and the news that little Tommy Brennan was missing hit the community like a physical blow. The diner where Sarah worked closed early. The hardware store owner locked up and drove straight to the Brennan house. Teachers from the elementary school arrived with thermoses of coffee and homemade sandwiches for the search teams. The volunteer search began at 3 p.m. 47 people showed up that first day. Local business owners, stay-at-home parents, teenagers who had graduated with Sarah years earlier. They divided into groups, each taking a different section of the woods, armed with flashlights, whistles, and a determination to bring Tommy home before dark. Sarah wanted to join the search, but the deputies wouldn't let her. "You need to stay here," Deputy Martinez explained, "in case he comes back, in case someone calls with information." So she sat in her living room, surrounded by neighbors and friends, listening to the sounds of people crashing through the woods behind her house, calling her son's name. The same name she'd been calling for hours, the same name that the forest seemed determined not to answer. As the sun began to set, the search teams returned with nothing. No sign of Tommy, no torn clothing, no footprints, no indication that an 8-year-old boy had ever walked into those woods at all. That night, Sarah didn't sleep. She sat by her front window, watching the empty street, hoping against hope that Tommy would come walking up the sidewalk with some innocent explanation for where he'd been. Behind her, Buddy lay on Tommy's bed, whimpering softly, his head resting on the pillow that still smelled like the boy he'd failed to protect. Chapter 5. Strange Behaviors. As the search for Tommy Brennan entered its second day, something unsettling began to emerge from the chaos of volunteer coordination and police interviews. People were acting strangely. Not obviously, not in ways that immediately raised red flags, but in subtle ways that made experienced investigators pause and take notice. The first person to draw attention was David Kellerman, the man who lived 3 houses down from the Brennans. David was 42 years old, a mechanic who kept to himself and rarely spoke to neighbors beyond a polite nod. But on the morning Tommy disappeared, David had been unusually visible. He'd been working in his yard, washing his car, taking out his trash. Activities that neighbors later realized they'd never seen him do all at once before. When Detective Linda Hayes interviewed David as part of the routine neighborhood canvass, she noticed something odd. David couldn't stop talking about his alibi. Before she'd even asked where he'd been that morning, he was volunteering information about his exact whereabouts, his work schedule, the people who could vouch for him. It was the kind of over-explanation that made seasoned investigators uncomfortable. "I was home all morning," David insisted, his hands fidgeting with a coffee mug, "working on my car. You can ask Mrs. Peterson across the street. She waves at me every morning when she gets her newspaper. She'll tell you I was there." But when Detective Hayes spoke to Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman seemed confused. "David, working on his car? Honey, I don't think I've seen that man outside before 10 in the morning in the 5 years I've lived here. He's usually still sleeping off whatever he was drinking the night before." More troubling was the behavior of Mark Stevens, a volunteer searcher who had shown up on the very first day. Mark was eager to help, perhaps too eager. He volunteered for every search team, insisted on taking the most difficult terrain, and had an unusual familiarity with the woods that made other volunteers uncomfortable. "It's like he knew exactly where to look," said Janet Mills, a teacher who had searched alongside Mark. "He kept leading us to specific areas, saying things like, 'Kids usually hide in places like this,' or 'If I were a lost boy, I'd probably go this way.' It felt wrong, like he was looking for something specific." When the search teams returned empty-handed day after day, Mark seemed more frustrated than the others, not disappointed, frustrated, as if the woods were failing to give up something he expected to find. But perhaps the most disturbing behavior came from someone much closer to home. Tommy's babysitter, 16-year-old Jessica Walsh, had been acting strangely ever since the disappearance. Jessica had watched Tommy dozens of times over the past year, and Sarah trusted her completely. But when Detective Hayes tried to interview Jessica about Tommy's recent behavior, the teenager became evasive and nervous. "I don't know anything," Jessica kept saying, her voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't seen Tommy in weeks. I've been busy with other things." But Sarah's work schedule showed that Jessica had babysit Tommy just 4 days before he disappeared. When confronted with this information, Jessica's story began to change. First, she said she'd forgotten about that day. Then she claimed it had been a normal evening, nothing unusual. Finally, she broke down crying and admitted that something had happened, but she couldn't talk about it. "I promised," she sobbed. "I promised Tommy I wouldn't tell anyone. But now he's gone and I don't know what to do." Detective Hayes pressed gently, but Jessica clammed up entirely. Her parents arrived and insisted on taking her home, claiming she was too traumatized to answer any more questions. They hired a lawyer that same evening. As the investigation deepened, more strange behaviors emerged. A postal worker who claimed he'd seen Tommy talking to a man in a blue pickup truck, but couldn't remember any details about the man or the truck. A store clerk who insisted Tommy had been in his shop the day before he disappeared, buying candy with money that Sarah knew her son didn't have. Most unsettling of all was the behavior of some of the other parents in the neighborhood. Instead of drawing their children closer, offering extra protection and supervision, several families had become notably less vigilant. Kids who had been carefully monitored all summer were suddenly allowed to play outside unsupervised. Parents who had always insisted on knowing their children's whereabouts were suddenly unconcerned about their kids' activities. It was as if Tommy's disappearance had created a strange sense of relief in some households, as if the terrible thing everyone feared had already happened, and now they could relax their guard. Detective Hayes made a note in her file. Multiple inconsistencies in witness statements, possible involvement of local residents. Recommend expanded background checks on all volunteers and neighbors. But what she didn't write down, what she couldn't quite put into words, was the feeling that everyone in Pine Ridge was hiding something, that Tommy Brennan's disappearance had exposed secrets that had been buried long before that July morning, secrets that someone was desperate to keep hidden. Chapter 6. The First Discovery. On the 5th day of the search, a volunteer named Robert Chen made the discovery that everyone had been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. Deep in the woods, nearly 2 miles from the Brennan house, he found something that had definitely belonged to Tommy. It was a small blue sneaker, size 2, with a distinctive scuff mark on the toe that Sarah immediately recognized. Tommy had gotten that scuff mark 3 weeks earlier when he'd tripped while running to catch the ice cream truck. Sarah had been annoyed about it at the time, telling him to be more careful with his new shoes. Now, holding that small sneaker in her hands, she would have given anything to go back and tell him that scuff marks didn't matter. The shoe was found at the base of a large pine tree, partially buried under fallen leaves and debris. It wasn't hidden exactly, but it wasn't sitting out in the open either. The location suggested that it had been there for several days, maybe since Tommy first disappeared. But there was something wrong with the scene, something that made the search team leader, Captain Morrison, immediately call for the area to be cordoned off and treated as a potential crime scene. The shoe was clean, too clean. After 5 days in the woods, through 2 rain showers and the constant dampness of the forest floor, Tommy's sneaker looked like it had been carefully washed and placed there recently. There was no mud, no significant wear from being outdoors, no organic matter clinging to the rubber sole. It looked like a shoe that had been removed from a child's foot and immediately placed in the woods. More troubling was what they didn't find around the shoe. No second shoe. No socks. No other clothing items. No signs of a struggle. No footprints leading to or away from the tree. The shoe was completely isolated, as if it had been dropped from the sky. Detective Hayes arrived at the scene within 30 minutes of the discovery. She spent 2 hours examining the area, photographing everything, collecting soil samples, looking for any evidence that might explain how Tommy's shoe had ended up in this specific location. "This doesn't make sense," she told Captain Morrison quietly, away from the volunteers and the gathering crowd of townspeople. "If Tommy lost his shoe here, where's the other one? If someone took his shoes off him, why leave just one? And why here? This location is completely random. It's not on any of the paths he would have taken. The discovery of the shoe should have been a breakthrough. Instead, it raised more questions than it answered. The search teams expanded their efforts, focusing on the area around the tree, looking for any other signs that Tommy had been there. They brought in cadaver dogs, hoping that the animals might pick up a scent that human searchers had missed. But the dogs found nothing. They showed no interest in the area around the tree, no indication that Tommy had ever been there. It was as if the shoe had been placed there by someone who had no connection to the boy who had worn it. Sarah's reaction to the discovery was devastating to witness. She clutched the shoe to her chest, sobbing with a grief that seemed to come from the deepest part of her soul. "This is his shoe," she kept saying. "This is Tommy's shoe. Where is he? Where is my baby?" The volunteers tried to comfort her, telling her that finding the shoe was progress, that it meant they were getting closer to bringing Tommy home. But Sarah wasn't comforted. She was a mother, and her instincts were screaming that something was very wrong with this discovery. "Tommy doesn't lose his shoes," she told Detective Hayes through her tears. "He's very careful with his things. He knows how hard I work to buy him nice clothes. He wouldn't just lose his shoe and keep walking." Detective Hayes had to agree. In all her years of investigating missing children cases, she'd never seen anything quite like this. The shoe was clearly evidence, but evidence of what? That Tommy had been in the woods? They already knew that something had happened to him. They already suspected that too. What the shoe really told them was that someone wanted it to be found. Someone had placed it in a location where search teams would eventually discover it. Someone was playing a game with the investigation, feeding them information in carefully measured doses. The question was, who? And more importantly, what were they trying to hide? As the sun set on the 5th day of Tommy's disappearance, the volunteers packed up their equipment and headed home, feeling like they'd accomplished something important. They'd found evidence, they'd made progress, but Detective Hayes stood in the growing darkness, staring at the tree where Tommy's shoe had been found, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Someone was manipulating this investigation, someone was controlling the narrative, and that someone was still out there, watching, waiting, planning their next move. Chapter 7. The case goes cold. 3 months passed without another significant discovery. The daily searches became weekly searches, then monthly searches, then occasional efforts by dedicated volunteers who refused to give up hope. The media attention that had briefly focused on Pine Ridge moved on to other stories, other tragedies, other missing children. Sarah Brennan's life became a surreal routine of grief and waiting. She returned to work at the diner because she needed the money, but her customers could see that she was somewhere else entirely. She would take orders with a blank expression, serve coffee with shaking hands, and sometimes stop mid-sentence as if she'd heard someone calling her name. Her co-workers tried to be understanding, but grief makes people uncomfortable. After a while, the sympathy cards stopped coming. The casseroles stopped appearing on her doorstep. The phone calls from well-meaning friends became less frequent. Pine Ridge, like every small town, had a limited capacity for sustained tragedy. The most painful part was the way people began to look at her. In the first weeks after Tommy's disappearance, she'd seen compassion in their eyes. Now she saw something else. Pity, yes, but also a kind of impatience, an unspoken suggestion that maybe it was time to move on, to accept reality, to stop hoping for something that was never going to happen. Detective Hayes continued working the case, but her resources were limited. The Pine Ridge County Sheriff's Department had other crimes to investigate, other cases that seemed more solvable. Tommy's file remained open, but it was no longer a priority. The investigation had generated dozens of leads, hundreds of tips, and thousands of hours of police work. But every lead had dead-ended. Every tip had led nowhere. Every witness had either been mistaken or lying. It was as if Tommy Brennan had simply vanished from existence, leaving behind only a single blue sneaker and a community full of unanswered questions. Sarah tried to maintain Tommy's room exactly as he'd left it. His bed stayed unmade from that last morning. His clothes remained in his dresser drawers. His toys sat on the shelves where he'd placed them, but the room felt hollow, like a museum exhibit of a life that had been interrupted. Buddy, Tommy's golden retriever, was struggling too. The dog had always been energetic and playful, but after Tommy's disappearance, he became listless and withdrawn. He would lie by the front door for hours, as if waiting for his boy to come home. He stopped eating regularly, stopped playing with his toys, stopped showing interest in anything except the occasional sound that might signal Tommy's return. The hardest part for Sarah was the dreams. Almost every night she would dream that Tommy was back. In these dreams, he would walk through the front door as if nothing had happened, asking for a snack or complaining about being hungry. She would hug him and ask where he'd been, and he would give her some perfectly innocent explanation that made complete sense in the dream logic. Then she would wake up to an empty house and the crushing realization that Tommy was still gone. By Christmas of 2019, Sarah had stopped decorating. She couldn't bear to put up the tree that Tommy had loved so much, couldn't handle the Christmas stockings that would include one for a boy who wasn't there to fill it. She worked double shifts during the holiday season, trying to exhaust herself enough that she could sleep without dreaming. The investigation officially moved to cold case status in January 2020. Detective Hayes filed her final report, summarizing the evidence they'd gathered and the leads they'd pursued. The file was thick with witness statements, search records, and forensic reports, but it told an incomplete story. A story without an ending. In her conclusion, Detective Hayes wrote, "Despite extensive investigation and community support, the disappearance of Tommy Brennan remains unsolved. Physical evidence is limited to one shoe discovered 5 days after the initial disappearance. No witnesses have provided reliable information about the child's whereabouts after 10:30 a.m. on July 15, 2019. The case will remain open pending new evidence or witness testimony." Mott. What she didn't write was her personal belief that someone in Pine Ridge knew exactly what had happened to Tommy Brennan, someone who had been lying from the very beginning, someone who was watching Sarah's grief with satisfaction, knowing that they had successfully hidden the truth. The months turned into years. 2020 became 2021, then 2022. Sarah aged rapidly, her hair turning grey, her face developing lines that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. She stopped talking about Tommy's return and started talking about his memory. She established a small scholarship fund at the elementary school in his name. She volunteered with organizations that helped families of missing children. But she never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that somehow, someday, she would learn the truth about what had happened to her son. And then, on a cold morning in March 2022, nearly 3 years after Tommy's disappearance, Buddy came back. Chapter 8. The Dog Returns. It was 6:47 a.m. on March 15, 2022, when Mrs. Rodriguez looked out her kitchen window and saw something that made her drop her coffee mug. The ceramic shattered on the floor, but she didn't notice. She was too focused on the impossible sight in Sarah Brennan's backyard. Buddy was sitting by the back door, exactly where he used to sit when he was waiting for Tommy to come outside and play. Mrs. Rodriguez rubbed her eyes, certain she was seeing things. Buddy had been gone for over a week. Sarah had been frantically searching for him, putting up posters, calling animal shelters, afraid that she was about to lose the last connection she had to her son. But there he was, sitting patiently as if he'd never left. And there was something in his mouth. Mrs. Rodriguez ran to her phone and called Sarah, who was getting ready for her morning shift at the diner. "Sarah, honey, you need to come outside right now." Sarah rushed out her back door in her work uniform, her heart pounding. She'd been devastated when Buddy disappeared, unable to handle the thought of losing him too. But now he was back, and she was so relieved that she didn't immediately notice what he was carrying. "Buddy! Oh my God, Buddy, where have you been?" She knelt down to hug him, and that's when she saw it. a small white sock, stained with something dark and unmistakable: blood. Sarah's hands were shaking as she tried to get the sock from Buddy's mouth. The dog was reluctant to give it up, whimpering and backing away, as if he knew the importance of what he was carrying, but wasn't sure he wanted to let it go. "It's okay, boy," Sarah whispered, though nothing about this was okay. "It's okay. Give it to me." When Buddy finally released the sock, Sarah saw immediately that it was Tommy's. She recognized the brand, the size, even the small hole near the toe that she'd been meaning to darn. But this sock was different from the one she remembered. It was dirty, stained with earth and moisture and something else. Something that made her stomach turn. The blood wasn't fresh. It had the dark, brownish color of old blood, blood that had been there for a long time. But it was definitely blood, and there was enough of it to suggest that someone had been seriously injured. Mrs. Rodriguez was already on the phone with 911. Within minutes, Sarah's backyard was filled with police officers, EMTs, and Detective Hayes, who had rushed over as soon as she heard the news. "Sarah, I need you to step back," Detective Hayes said gently. "This is evidence now. We need to handle it properly." But Sarah couldn't step back. She couldn't stop staring at the sock, at the blood, at Buddy, who was pacing nervously around the yard as if he had more to show them but didn't know how to communicate it. "Where did you get this?" she asked the dog, knowing he couldn't answer. "Where have you been, Buddy? Where is Tommy?" Detective Hayes carefully bagged the sock and began examining Buddy for any other evidence he might be carrying. The dog was dirty, his golden fur matted with mud and debris. He smelled like the deep woods, like he'd been living rough for days. But he wasn't injured, wasn't malnourished. He'd been somewhere that had provided him with food and shelter. "We need to follow him," Sarah said suddenly. "He knows where Tommy is. He's been trying to tell us." Detective Hayes nodded. "We're going to do that. But first, we need to process this evidence. We need to figure out where he's been." A team of officers with tracking dogs arrived within an hour. They gave the dogs Buddy's scent and began following his trail backward from the house. The trail led into the woods, but not in the direction where Tommy's shoe had been found. This trail went deeper, into areas that the original search teams had covered only briefly. The dogs followed the scent trail for almost 3 miles, through dense forest, across a small stream, and up a steep hillside that most of the original searchers had considered too difficult for an 8-year-old boy to navigate. Finally, they reached a place where the trail seemed to end, a small clearing surrounded by thick trees with what looked like the remains of a temporary campsite. There were signs that someone had been living there recently. A circle of stones where a fire had been built, some empty cans and food containers, a makeshift shelter built against a large fallen log, but no sign of Tommy. Detective Hayes examined the campsite carefully, looking for any evidence that might explain what had happened there. She found more bloodstains on some of the rocks around the fire pit. She found scraps of fabric that matched the description of the clothes Tommy had been wearing when he disappeared. She found a small wooden toy car that Sarah immediately recognized as one of Tommy's favorites. What she didn't find was any sign of what had happened to the boy himself. "Someone was keeping him here," she told Captain Morrison quietly. "Someone had him in this campsite for, we don't know how long, but something happened, something that left blood behind." The evidence was sent to the state crime lab for analysis. The blood on the sock was confirmed to be Tommy's. The DNA tests would take weeks, but the preliminary results suggested that the blood was approximately 2.5 years old, dating to roughly 6 months after Tommy's initial disappearance, which meant that Tommy had been alive for at least 6 months after he vanished from his backyard. Someone had been holding him, caring for him, keeping him in that remote campsite. But what had happened next? Where was Tommy now? And why had Buddy waited almost 3 years to bring back this evidence? As the investigation reopened with renewed intensity, one question haunted everyone involved. If Tommy had been alive for months after his disappearance, and if someone had been keeping him in that campsite, then who was responsible? And what had finally gone wrong? The answers would prove to be more devastating than anyone could have imagined. Chapter 9. The truth emerges. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. David Kellerman, the neighbor who had been so eager to provide an alibi on the day Tommy disappeared, walked into the Pine Ridge Police Department on March 20th, 2022, and asked to speak with Detective Hayes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands were shaking, and he kept glancing over his shoulder as if someone was following him. When Detective Hayes sat down across from him in the interview room, David immediately broke down. "I can't do this anymore," he sobbed. "I can't keep lying, not after the dog came back, not after what I've done." Detective Hayes turned on the recording equipment and read David his rights. She'd been a cop for 15 years, and she'd learned to recognize the moment when someone was about to confess to something terrible. "David, I need you to tell me exactly what happened." What came next was a story that would haunt everyone who heard it. David admitted that he had been watching Tommy for months before the disappearance. He'd noticed the boy's routine, his love of the woods, his mother's work schedule. He'd been planning to take Tommy for weeks, waiting for the right opportunity. "I never meant to hurt him," David said through his tears. I was so lonely. I wanted a son. I wanted someone to care about me." And on the morning of July 15th, 2019, David had waited until Sarah was asleep, then lured Tommy into the woods with promises of showing him a family of deer he'd seen. Tommy had trusted him. He was a neighbor, someone who had always been friendly, someone who had no reason to hurt him. David had taken Tommy to the remote campsite, a place he'd discovered years earlier during his own walks in the woods. He'd prepared it in advance, stocking it with food, blankets, and games. He'd convinced himself that he was rescuing Tommy from a life of poverty and single parenthood. "I told him his mother was sick," David said. "I told him she was in the hospital and had asked me to take care of him. He believed me. He was just a little kid. He trusted me." For months, David had kept Tommy at the campsite. He'd visit every day, bringing food, playing games, reading stories. He'd convinced himself that Tommy was happy, that he was being a good father figure. "He kept asking about his mother," David continued. "He kept asking when he could go home. I kept telling him soon, just a little longer. I thought eventually he would forget about his old life and accept me as his father." But Tommy never forgot. He never stopped asking about his mother, never stopped trying to leave the campsite. And as the months passed, David's fantasy began to crumble. The truth was that Tommy had never been safe. David's mental state had been deteriorating for years. He'd been drinking heavily, losing touch with reality, becoming increasingly unstable. The isolation of the campsite, the stress of keeping Tommy hidden, the constant fear of being discovered, it had all taken its toll. "I started getting angry," David admitted, "when he wouldn't stop crying for his mother, when he wouldn't eat, when he tried to run away. I lost control." The incident that had led to the blood-stained sock had happened in January 2020, about 6 months after Tommy's disappearance. Tommy had tried to escape during one of David's visits, running into the woods in an attempt to find his way home. David had chased him, caught him, and in his rage had struck the boy with a rock. "There was so much blood," David said, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought I'd killed him. I thought it was over." But Tommy had survived. Injured, terrified, but alive. David had tried to care for him, to treat his wounds, but he had no medical training, no real understanding of what he was doing. Tommy had developed an infection, had become delirious with fever. "He was calling for his mother," David said, over and over. "I want my mommy, I want to go home." I couldn't make him stop. I couldn't make him understand that I was trying to help him. Tommy's condition had worsened over several days. David had known the boy needed real medical attention, but he was too afraid to seek help, too afraid of being caught, of losing the son he'd convinced himself he was saving. "He died on a Tuesday," David said, the words coming out flat and emotionless, as if he'd rehearsed them 1,000 times. February 3rd, 2020. He just stopped breathing. I tried to wake him up, but he was gone. Detective Hayes felt sick. Tommy Brennan had been alive for almost 7 months after his disappearance. 7 months of being held captive by a delusional neighbor. 7 months of asking for his mother. 7 months of slowly dying from neglect and abuse. "What did you do with his body?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. David's face crumpled. "I buried him, deep in the woods, about a mile from the campsite. I marked the spot with a pile of stones. I told myself I was giving him a proper burial. But that wasn't the end of David's confession. There was more. Something that explained why Buddy had disappeared for a week before returning with the blood-stained sock. "The dog," David said. "Buddy. He found the campsite about 3 years ago, right after Tommy died. He kept coming back, digging around, looking for something. I tried to scare him away, but he wouldn't leave." David had been visiting Tommy's grave regularly since 2020, bringing flowers, talking to the makeshift headstone he'd created. It was during one of these visits that Buddy had appeared, following some scent or instinct that had led him to the place where his boy had died. "Last week, when I saw the dog again, I knew it was over," David said. "I knew he was going to lead people back there. I tried to catch him, to stop him, but he ran away. He had that sock in his mouth. I'd kept some of Tommy's things as mementos. The dog must have taken it from the campsite." Detective Hayes's hands were shaking as she took notes. The story was horrific, but it answered so many questions that had haunted the investigation for 3 years. Why Tommy's shoe had been found in a random location. David had planted it there to throw off the search. Why the neighborhood volunteers had seemed nervous. Some of them had suspected David, but hadn't wanted to believe their neighbor could be capable of such a thing. Why Buddy had refused to enter the woods during the original search. The dog had sensed something terrible had happened to his boy. "Where is Tommy's body now?" Detective Hayes asked. David gave her detailed directions to the burial site. Within hours, a team of investigators was hiking through the woods, following David's map to a remote area that the original search teams had never thoroughly explored. They found the grave exactly where David had said it would be. A small pile of stones in a clearing with wildflowers that David had been planting for 2 years. Underneath, wrapped in a blanket that had once belonged on Tommy's own bed, they found the remains of an 8-year-old boy who had died calling for his mother. The autopsy would confirm David's story. Tommy had died from complications related to a head injury, exactly as David had described. But the medical examiner also found evidence of prolonged malnutrition, untreated infections, and psychological trauma that would have been devastating for a child to endure. Tommy Brennan hadn't just been murdered. He'd been tortured, slowly and systematically, by a man who had convinced himself he was showing love. Chapter 10. The Devastating Revelation. But David Kellerman's confession wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of an even more devastating revelation that would shatter everything the community thought they knew about Tommy's disappearance. 3 days after David's arrest, Detective Hayes received a phone call that changed everything. It was from Jessica Walsh, the teenage babysitter who had been so evasive during the original investigation. Now 19 years old and living 3 states away, Jessica had seen the news about David's confession and felt compelled to finally tell the truth. "I need to tell you what really happened," Jessica said, her voice trembling over the phone. "What I should have told you 3 years ago." Jessica flew back to Pine Ridge the next day and sat in the same interview room where David had confessed. But her story was different. Shocking in a way that made Detective Hayes question everything she thought she understood about the case. "David didn't take Tommy," Jessica said. "I mean, he did, but that's not how it started. Tommy came to him. Tommy asked to be taken." Detective Hayes felt the world shift beneath her feet. "What do you mean he asked to be taken?" Jessica's story was almost too horrible to believe. On the night of July 11th, 2019, 4 days before Tommy disappeared, Jessica had been babysitting him while Sarah worked a late shift. Tommy had been unusually quiet, withdrawn, not his normal cheerful self. He kept saying he wanted to go live with someone else, Jessica explained. He said he was tired of being poor, tired of his mother always being sad, tired of never having nice things like the other kids. But there was more. Tommy had been talking to David Kellerman for weeks before his disappearance, not because David was grooming him, but because Tommy was seeking him out. The lonely 8-year-old had noticed that David lived alone, seemed to have money, drove a nice car. Tommy asked me if I thought David would want a son, Jessica said, tears streaming down her face. He said he'd been watching David's house, and David seemed lonely too. He thought they could help each other. And in the night of July 11th, Tommy had made Jessica promise to keep a secret. He told her that he was going to ask David if he could come live with him. He'd convinced himself that his mother would be happier without him, that she was struggling to take care of him, that everyone would be better off if he just disappeared. I told him it was a crazy idea, Jessica said. I told him his mother loved him more than anything in the world, but he wouldn't listen. He said his mind was made up. Jessica had been terrified to tell anyone about this conversation. She was 16 years old, barely more than a child herself, and she couldn't understand the full implications of what Tommy was planning. She'd hoped that he would forget about it, that his childish fantasy would fade. But on the morning of July 15th, Tommy had put his plan into action. He'd gone into the woods, knowing that David often walked there. He'd found David and asked him the question that would seal both their fates. Would you like to have a son? David, already mentally unstable and desperate for connection, had seen Tommy's request as a gift from heaven. He'd convinced himself that the boy genuinely wanted to be with him, that he was rescuing Tommy from an unhappy life. David told me all this later, Jessica continued. After Tommy died, he came to my house, completely broken, and told me everything. He said Tommy had begged him to take him away, had promised he wanted to stay with him forever. But David's version of events had been distorted by his mental illness and his desperate need to justify what he'd done. The truth was more complex and more heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. Tommy had indeed approached David, but not because he really wanted to leave his mother. He'd done it because he was an 8-year-old child who had absorbed too much of his mother's stress, who had convinced himself that he was a burden, who had made a desperate and tragic decision based on a child's limited understanding of the world. He thought he was helping his mom, Jessica sobbed. He thought if he disappeared, she wouldn't have to work so hard anymore. He didn't understand that she would rather be poor with him than rich without him. The revelation recontextualized everything about the case. Tommy hadn't been abducted by a predator. He'd been manipulated by his own innocent desire to help his struggling mother. David Kellerman wasn't just a kidnapper and murderer. He was a broken man who had taken advantage of a child's misguided self-sacrifice. But Jessica's confession raised another devastating question. If she had known about Tommy's plan, if she had understood what he was thinking, could she have prevented his death? I replay that night over and over, Jessica said. I wonder if I could have said something different, done something different. I was just a kid myself, but I should have told someone. I should have protected him. Detective Hayes tried to comfort her, explaining that the responsibility lay with David, not with a teenage babysitter who had been put in an impossible situation. But Jessica's guilt was overwhelming. There's one more thing, Jessica said. Something David told me that I've never told anyone. She paused, struggling to find the words for something that had haunted her for 3 years. Tommy never stopped loving his mother. Even at the end, even when he was dying, he was talking about her. David said Tommy's last words were, "Tell my mommy I'm sorry. Tell her I just wanted to help." The room fell silent. Detective Hayes realized that Tommy's story wasn't just about a child who had been murdered. It was about a little boy who had loved his mother so much that he'd been willing to sacrifice himself for her happiness. And in trying to help her, he'd walked straight into the hands of someone who would destroy them both. Chapter 11. The Weight of Truth. Sarah Brennan sat in her living room, surrounded by the same neighbors and friends who had comforted her 3 years earlier, listening to Detective Hayes explain the truth about her son's disappearance. But this time, there was no hope left to cling to. This time, the news was final. The woman who had spent 3 years imagining every possible scenario, every potential ending to Tommy's story, had never imagined this. She had feared that he'd been killed by a stranger, worried that he'd gotten lost and died alone in the woods, even wondered if he'd somehow chosen to run away. But she had never, not once, considered that he had disappeared because he thought it would make her life better. "He thought he was helping me," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "My baby thought he was helping me." The guilt was crushing. Sarah began to relive every conversation she'd had with Tommy in the weeks before his disappearance, looking for signs she'd missed, clues that might have warned her about what he was planning. She remembered him asking questions about money, about why she had to work so much, about whether she would be happier if she didn't have to take care of him. She'd thought these were normal questions from a curious child. She'd never imagined they were the thoughts of a little boy who was planning to sacrifice himself for her sake. "I should have known," Sarah said over and over. "I should have seen it. I should have told him that nothing in the world mattered more to me than him." Detective Hayes tried to explain that 8-year-old children don't think like adults, that Tommy's decision had been based on a child's limited understanding of the world, but Sarah couldn't be comforted. She was drowning in the realization that her son had died, believing he was unwanted, believing he was a burden. The community's reaction to the truth was complex and painful. David Kellerman was clearly guilty of murder, but the revelation that Tommy had approached him first created an uncomfortable moral ambiguity that nobody knew how to process. Some people felt that David deserved sympathy as well as punishment, arguing that he was a mentally ill man who had been manipulated by circumstances beyond his control. Others were furious that anyone would suggest David was anything other than a child killer who deserved the harshest possible sentence. The trial, when it came, was a media sensation that brought unwanted attention back to Pine Ridge. Reporters descended on the small town, interviewing anyone willing to talk about Tommy, about David, about the 3 years of lies and secrets that had finally been exposed. David Kellerman pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and kidnapping. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, he apologized to Sarah, but his words felt hollow, inadequate for the magnitude of what he'd done. "I thought I was saving him," David said, looking directly at Sarah. "I thought I was giving him a better life. I know now that I was sick, that I was wrong about everything, but I want you to know that I loved him. In my own broken way, I loved your son." Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't find words for the complex mixture of rage and pity she felt toward the man who had destroyed her life while claiming to love her child. Jessica Walsh also faced legal consequences for her failure to report Tommy's plan, though the charges were minimal given her age at the time and the impossible position she'd been placed in. She was sentenced to community service and mandatory counseling, but the real punishment was the guilt she would carry for the rest of her life. The most devastating part of the trial was the testimony about Tommy's final months. The medical evidence painted a picture of a child who had suffered tremendously, both physically and emotionally. Tommy had been malnourished, injured, and psychologically traumatized. He had asked for his mother constantly, had tried to escape multiple times, had died alone and in pain, far from everyone who loved him. But perhaps the most heartbreaking detail was something David had mentioned almost in passing during his confession. In the weeks before Tommy's death, the boy had begun to understand that his plan hadn't worked the way he'd intended. He'd realized that his disappearance hadn't made his mother happier. It had destroyed her. He kept asking me to let him go home, David had told investigators. He said he'd made a mistake, that he needed to tell his mommy he was sorry. He said she must be so sad without him. Tommy had died, knowing that his sacrifice had been meaningless, that his attempt to help his mother had only caused her unbearable pain. He died wanting to go home to a woman who would have given anything to hold him one more time. The trial ended. David was led away to prison, and Pine Ridge tried to return to normal. But normal was impossible now. The community had been forever changed by the knowledge that one of their neighbors had been capable of such horror, and that a little boy's love for his mother had led him into the hands of a killer. Sarah struggled to find meaning in the aftermath of the trial. She'd gotten justice in the legal sense, but justice felt empty when her son was still gone. She'd gotten answers, but the answers only made the loss more painful. The hardest part was learning to live with the knowledge that Tommy's last coherent thoughts had been about her, that he'd died loving her, missing her, regretting the choice that had taken him away from her. He just wanted to help, she would tell people who asked how she was coping. My little boy just wanted to help his mommy, and it got him killed. Chapter 12. What Remains? 5 years have passed since Tommy Brennan's body was found in those remote woods. 5 years since the truth about his disappearance finally came to light. 5 years since a small town learned that evil can hide behind the most ordinary faces, and that love, even innocent love, can sometimes lead to tragedy. Sarah Brennan still lives in the same house on Maple Street, though she's changed almost everything about it. Tommy's room has been converted into a small office where she works on behalf of other families dealing with missing children. The backyard where Tommy used to play with Buddy is now a memorial garden, with flowers that bloom in cycles throughout the year, ensuring that something beautiful is always growing in the place where her son used to laugh. She never remarried, never had other children. Tommy was my whole world, she explains to the reporters who still occasionally call on the anniversary of his disappearance. I can't imagine loving anyone the way I loved him. But Sarah has found a different kind of purpose in her grief. She's become an advocate for better mental health resources in small communities, arguing that David Kellerman's deteriorating mental state should have been recognized and treated before it reached the point where he could harm a child. She speaks at conferences about childhood trauma, about the ways that economic stress can affect families, about the importance of teaching children that they are never, ever responsible for their parents' happiness. Tommy thought he was helping me by disappearing, she tells audiences of parents and teachers and social workers. But what he needed to know was that he was helping me just by existing, just by being my son. I wish I had told him that more often. Buddy lived for 2 more years after Tommy's body was found, but he was never the same dog he'd been before. He seemed to understand that his boy was never coming home, and he spent his final years as Sarah's quiet companion, providing comfort without ever quite overcoming his own grief. When Buddy died in his sleep in 2024, Sarah buried him in the memorial garden under a small stone that read, "He never stopped looking for his boy." David Kellerman remains in prison, where he will spend the rest of his life. Prison records show that he's been diagnosed with several mental illnesses and is receiving treatment. But it's too little, too late for the child whose life he destroyed. He writes letters to Sarah occasionally, letters that she never opens. Her lawyer reads them and tells her their apologies, pleas for forgiveness, expressions of regret. But Sarah isn't interested in David's remorse. She's focused on making sure that no other family has to endure what she's endured. Jessica Walsh moved across the country after the trial, but she still calls Sarah every year on Tommy's birthday. The guilt she carries hasn't diminished with time, despite years of therapy and the rational understanding that she was a child herself when Tommy made his tragic decision. "I should have known," she tells Sarah during these annual calls. "I should have protected him." And Sarah always responds the same way. "You were just a kid too, Jessica. We were all just kids who didn't understand how dangerous the world could be." The town of Pine Ridge has slowly healed, but the scars remain visible. The elementary school now has a memorial plaque for Tommy in the main hallway, and the teachers receive annual training on recognizing signs of stress in children from struggling families. The police department has implemented new protocols for missing child cases, and the community has established a fund to provide mental health services for residents who can't afford them. But perhaps the most significant change is in the way parents talk to their children about family problems. Tommy's story has become a cautionary tale that spreads far beyond Pine Ridge, a reminder that children need to be explicitly told that they are not responsible for their parents' struggles, that they are loved unconditionally, that there is nothing they could ever do to make their parents' lives better than having them in it. The woods where Tommy died have been marked with a small cross that hikers sometimes find when they venture deep enough into the wilderness. It's a simple memorial, just two pieces of wood nailed together, but someone, probably Sarah, keeps it decorated with fresh flowers and small toys. Children who never knew Tommy leave notes there sometimes, messages that say things like, "I'm sorry this happened to you and I hope you're happy now." On quiet nights, when the wind moves through the trees in just the right way, some people claim they can hear the sound of a child laughing, playing with a dog that barks with joy. It's probably just the wind, just the normal sounds of a forest at night, but in a town that's seen too much sadness, people choose to believe in the possibility that Tommy Brennan is finally at peace, finally understanding that he was loved more than he could ever have imagined. The truth about Tommy's disappearance is brutal and heartbreaking, but it's also a reminder of something that every parent, every teacher, every adult who works with children needs to remember. Love is not a burden. Children are not responsible for their parents' happiness, and sometimes the most important thing you can tell a child is not how much you sacrifice for them, but how much joy they bring to your life, just by being exactly who they are. Tommy Brennan died believing he was unwanted. He died trying to help a mother who would have chosen poverty with him over wealth without him every single day. His story is a tragedy, but it's also a lesson. A reminder that our children are listening to everything we say, watching everything we do, and forming conclusions about their worth based on the messages we send them, both intentional and unintentional. In the end, Tommy's legacy isn't just about the horrible way he died. It's about the love he felt for his mother and the love she felt for him. It's about the reminder that in a world full of dangers we can't always protect our children from, the one thing we can control is making sure they know, beyond any doubt, that they are wanted, valued, and loved exactly as they are. The boy who vanished in the forest is gone forever, but the love between a mother and her son, that remains eternal.